Hi, welcome. I'm turning on my light. It's my weekly live stream. Nice to have you here. Today's topic is yoga and the building blocks of the brain. I'll wait a couple of moments till some people come on. So you might have some questions about the brain and its building blocks and what that means. And so feel free to ask those questions here. And if you missed the live stream, of course, you're welcome to leave questions and comments in the comment area. I'm happy to answer those questions later on. I want to kind of frame the conversation today around this idea that the brain develop, right? It's about brain development, and then how do we use the tools of yoga to intervene at the levels that the brain perhaps had some challenges in developing. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And I'm using this idea of building blocks of the brain because it comes from one really nice teacher named Bruce Perry. Can you see that? There he is. Yeah, Bruce Perry. I called him Rick Perry once. He's from Texas too. So I had to apologize after that. But anyway, when I was giving a lecture. This book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, it's a wonderful book to understand. It's a wonderfully written book, very, very fun, and lots of great stories, and a wonderful book to understand how the brain organizes itself, how it develops, and then understanding how we can create shifts in the brain. We can elicit those neuroplastic changes in the brain based on where we need them developmentally. So Dr. Perry looks at a lot of childhood trauma. He was the guy who was called in the case of Waco, Texas, where there were all these kids in this compound, and many of them actually died, but they had pulled a big group of them out. And he was the guy called in to help with these children. And he just worked on a lot of really intense childhood trauma cases. So, and then started to develop his model. Now, his model, and by the way, this is his model of the brain. And what I always like to say about models is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is not your brain. This is the model of your brain. But it helps us to understand that the brain starts at the brainstem. That's the first thing that gets laid down. And then these other structures, the midbrain and the limbic brain and the cortex, get laid down on top of the brainstem. Another way, and they develop that way. So why do you have your brainstem first? Does it make sense? Because your brainstem is like breathing and heart rate and your breathing, heart rate. So it has something to do with sleep, but thermoregulation, your temperature. It has to do with all of these things that are deep under the level of consciousness that the body is constantly having to mediate, right? Without you having to think about. And then the brainstem, and then on top of the brainstem is the midbrain, which is involved in, it's kind of the middle between the front brain rational stuff and then brainstem, no connection to consciously. So midbrain, like if I threw something in the air and you had to grab it, that's something that the midbrain does, because it kind of coordinates sensory movements with conscious thought, with a little bit of conscious thought, and also has to do with regulating hormones, and so it's involved in regulating of the system. So you get brainstem, then midbrain, and then limbic brain. You probably have heard of limbic brain. That has to do with processing of emotions, reactions, stress response. And then on top of that, you get the cortex, right? So what we know is that these lower brain systems evolve first. The brainstem and the lower systems develop first because they are essential for safety, and they're less plastic. There's less capacity to change them. And then the front brain develops last, much more capacity. Another metaphor that I love is this one, the metaphor of the flower. So the brain unfolds like a flower, right? So the stem, and this flower is kind of, almost in bloom, but it really is a good metaphor, because this is the brain stem, and the stem of the flower, and where all this energy is packed, especially when it's in a bud. And then as the flower starts to open, we get the midbrain, the limbic brain, and then that openness. Why does your front brain do what it can do? Why does it have the creativity? Why does it have the capacity for rational thought? Because everything is healthy underneath it. So a key piece here is that nothing gets into your front brain. Nothing gets into your front brain directly. It has to go through these systems, right? It has to go through these lower brain systems. So if you have dysfunction in the lower brain systems, your thoughts are going to be irrational. Your thoughts are going to be irrational. Your thoughts are going to be reactive. Your feelings, your behaviors, all of that is going to be influenced by the brainstem systems or the lower brain systems. Why is this so important? Well, when children don't have the attachment that they need, a good sense of feeling connected and attached in those first 3 years of life, because that's when 85% of your brain is developing, then we start having behavioral problems or dysfunctional thoughts or depression, anxiety, all of those psycho-emotional challenges that are so common, prevalent in our culture can arise because those systems are not functional. Now, how do we get to those lower systems? That's the next question. So we get to the lower systems through feelings, behaviors, activities that normally would have happened in early infancy. And one of them is rocking, so you think about some of the things like in Qigong, the shaking and the rocking movements, or in kirtan, where there's rocking side to side, or even dancing. A lot of those rhythmic movements really drive those deeper systems in the nervous system, which is why they can create self-regulation. You can start to self-regulate because of those deeper systems are being affected via this kind of rhythmic movement. So yoga is not just rhythmic, but one of the things that we often do with yoga practices is repeat them. Either we do the practice day after day after day, and or within the practice we repeat. And it's those repetitive experiences of nice feelings in your body, and kind and compassionate thoughts coming in from the front brain that can help bring healing and a shift to those parts of the system that are quite difficult to change. So we can't expect to get to the brainstem by the cortex. I mean, there's a little bit, according to Bessel van der Kolk, there's a little bit of connectivity between some of the front brain stuff and the brainstem systems. But we can get to those systems in a more sort of natural, holistic, and appropriate way via the feelings in the body, the interoceptive feelings in the body. So it's always a circuit or it's always a feedback loop. We're always using the front brain and the brain stem, and they're kind of playing off of each other. But yoga practices really can help us to self-regulate, not just cognitively. And that's one of the biggest challenges right now in the mental health community, is trying to help people self-regulate with the front brain, with cognitive behavioral strategies, which work great when you're talking about trying to get more plasticity and make more changes in the cortex, but are not that useful when you're talking about the brainstem. So yoga is a great complement to whatever therapeutic approach that you're using, particularly if the yoga is slow, mindful, is helping to increase the skill of embodiment, is bringing feelings of compassion, kindness, safety, comfort. All of those things are helping us to reclaim some of what we may have been dysfunctional from childhood. Okay, so that's the this model, neurosequential model of therapeutics, he calls it, this model. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying, like, if you need to do therapy, then start with where the dysfunction occurred. And one of the great stories he tells in this book is a story of a kid who was an orphan in Russia. And the kid really was having trouble self-regulating, and he realized he wanted to use the kid's classmates to help the kid regulate. So he went in and talked to the classmates and said, he's a little different. His brain's a little different, and had this really nice conversation with the kids. And then the kids helped to self-regulate this kid who had been adopted from Russia. And why did he think that was appropriate? Well, one of the reasons he thought it was appropriate was because in the orphanage where the kid had been staying, when he was a baby, from the time he was, I think, born until 2 years old, I think he was, or 18 months, I can't remember. During that time, there were 60 other kids, 60 other babies in this orphanage, and with only 2 caregivers for 8-hour shifts. And then these kids would, the caregivers would rotate. And so the only thing the caregivers had time to do was to change the baby's diapers and feed them. And then they went on. So there wasn't any of the typical, rocking and cooing and talking and playing with that children typically get from a more attentive caregiver. And so what the kids did was they started reaching out through their cribs and holding each other's hands. They started talking to each other. When this child was adopted, he was speaking a language, and the parents thought the language must be Russian. So they had all these different translators come and try and figure out what he was speaking. And finally, what they realized is that he was speaking a language that the children had made up themselves as a way to communicate with each other. They had their own different words. So they had just come up with some sort of a proto language, some sort of a primitive language to express themselves. And so these kids were self-regulating each other. And so he used the classroom of this young boy who was having behavior and other challenges to help him regulate. I just think it's such a heartbreaking and warm, fuzzy story at the same time. So great book. I highly recommend it. It's a great read, and I think you may really enjoy it if you want to get into it. And then I already mentioned how yoga is connected to this in terms of self-regulation, but I think there's so much more. I think there's always more ways that we can be creative with the practices to help complement whatever kind of therapeutics the neuroscientists are starting to discover are so effective. I want to say one more thing, which is that, this book is about kids primarily and kids development, but guess what? We're all just big kids, essentially, when you're working with adults who are having dysfunctional thoughts, behavior challenges, anxiety, depression, trauma symptoms, we can still look at this model, and see where did the dysfunction occur developmentally. How can we bring practices in that may be useful? To his credit, and he's a brilliant guy, he also has a training program for mental health practitioners. So I highly recommend his work. I think it's great work, and I think it's really exciting to see what's going on out there in the mental health world. And it's also really exciting to see the intersection and the segue with what we're doing in terms of embodiment and in terms of regulation from that kind of body up perspective. So I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks, Nancy. Nancy gave me a rose for this rose. Thank you for being here. Please feel free to leave questions. It's really nice to have you here, and I'll see you next week. Feel free to leave suggestions for next week's live stream too. I'm always happy to take suggestions. Namaste.